Ready? Hello. This is a talk from the Center of Excellence on Autism Spectrum Disorders at Southern Connecticut State University. Next slide, please. This talk is on assisting students with autism in the college classroom. I'm Fred Volkmar, I'm the director of the Autism Center, and along with my colleagues Kim Bean and Barbara Cook, we're going to be doing this talk today primarily aimed at college faculty as they work with the increasing number of students with autism who are enrolled in college. Next slide, please. Part one. I'm going to be talking about autism spectrum disorders, some historical perspectives, and some key attributes before we get into some practical strategies. Next slide, please. Let me say a word about the development of the field. Probably the first reports of children with autism go back somewhat in time. They may have been the reports of feral children like Victor the Wild Boy. Clearly there have been reports from institutions in the 1800s of children who probably had autism. It was the real genius of Leo Kanner back in 1943 who first described autism. He said this was two things. He said these were children who came into the world with autistic aloneness, autism. They lived in their own worlds. They weren't connected with their parents and other people. And he said they had troubles with insistence on sameness. They did not do well with changes in the environment or routine. A year later, a man named Hans Asperger talked about autistic personality disorder. He used the same word, but these were boys who were more verbal and had special interests and often a positive family history. This really sets the tension between a strict and a narrow version of autism and a much broader view of what's now called the broader autism phenotype. Next slide, please. So what's in a name? The word autos is defined in the Oxford Dictionary, says that this has actually several different meanings in the Greek depending on the context. It can refer to self, but it can also refer to sameness. So in a very important way, Leo Kanner with this word has captured the two elements of what he saw as essential in autism. Next slide, please. So what's in a name? And this is a picture on the side of me talking to a Boy Scout troop in Wallingford, Connecticut. They had a student who tried to join the group and he had Asperger's and he dropped out because he didn't think the other students liked him. And the reason he thought that was he kept trying to talk about his longstanding interest in toasters, which was not a big topic of interest with other Boy Scouts. And in talking to these boys, it became apparent to me that one of the ways it may be easiest to understand autism is for the moment to put aside the A words and rather to think about learning disabilities. Autism is essentially a kind of a hidden learning disability. And when I talk to the troop and explain, yes, they want to support people with disabilities of all kinds, it's easier to understand when you look at a person and you realize, oh, they've got glasses, they've got a cane, they've got a wheelchair. That's a visible disability. Autism, like many learning problems, is a hidden disability. In that sense, it taps into a much broader, long tradition within the United States, providing right to education, rights to non-discrimination, access, and accommodations. And this is a part of a much broader view of disabilities and also civil rights for everyone. And for educators, I think it's also sometimes an easier way to understand the problem. That autism is a different kind of a learning disability. It's different because it starts so early in life, it's so pervasive, and it really impacts social skills. Next slide, please. Just very quickly to say something about the neuroscience of autism. This is my colleague at Yale, Jamie McPartland, who does EEG work. One of the interesting things is that we actually see differences in the ways that the brains of people with autism spectrum disorder process social stimuli, things like looking at faces. Next slide, please. And this shows you one of Jamie's really essential findings. This finding actually is being reviewed right now by the Food and Drug Administration as being a potential biomarker for autism. And the finding is that if people, typical people versus folks with autism, just look at faces, we get a different pattern of EEG activity, which speaks to the fact that the processing in the brain is happening in different ways. Next slide, please. So if you come into the social world with a social frame, without a social frame, sorry, you fail to play the social game. You have trouble understanding and integrating multiple cues, what psychology calls executive function. You have trouble with temporal processing. You have a tendency to process things in chunks. You have unusual and often idiosyncratic learning styles. You may have trouble with perspective taking, and thus you have social difficulties. Most of us who are typically developing are constantly shifting our perspective to take in the views of our audience, our speakers, our children, our spouses. We're moving very, very, very rapidly, taking this all in and moving right along. This is hard for people in the autism spectrum. They may have trouble engaging in joint attention, imitation, incidental learning. All these are things that happen in the first year of life without formal training of the typical baby. While certainly people with autism see people, they may see people more, in fact, as objects as opposed to a very different category of folk. Their focus may be on the non-social world. They may be very upset by non-social trivial changes in the environment, and they seek things like consistency and regularity. And they may, as young children, have a lack of interest in communicating. And of course, that's really essential for us to understand the feelings, thoughts, and intentions of others. Next slide. This is a quick slide to show you some of the work on the brain basis of autism, back to understanding the EEG patterns of differences in face discrimination. This is a study done some years ago. It's now been very well replicated with over 20 replications independently. This is an fMRI study, so it's perfectly safe, uses MRI, not radiation. We asked typical people and folks on the autism spectrum to look at faces and objects. We were interested in this fMRI study looking at activity, especially within the fusiform gyrus, which for most of us is organized at least in part as a face area. I should point out that both groups were equally accurate. The task was always the same or different, same or different, same or different, same or different, faces versus objects. We also looked at patterns. I'm not going to talk so much about that today. Next slide. And here's what we found. Here you can see a so-called coronal slice. This is down a plane of the brain where you can see that fusiform gyrus on the left and the right side, on the left-hand picture, but you can see it both on the left and the right side of the brain activating the red and yellow, that face area, which is just what we expect. But look on the right-hand side of this picture, and you see people with autism, autism spectrum disorder, Asperger's. If you don't have that same activation, they're not using that same part of the brain to see faces in a special way. Next slide, please. Another strategy, and I don't know if my slide presenter can click on the video to show this, but we can show people with autism short movies. Whoops, back please. Back please. Here we go. We won't try to click on it. We showed people with autism short clips from the classic movie Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And then we can use something called eye tracking technology, which is infrared, to look at exactly where they look on the screen in this intensely social, intensely personal movie. And our first two people were a man with autism I've known very well for many years, who's a man with actually 2 master's degrees, has classic autism and a typical viewer. Next slide, please. And this is what we got. This is just a few seconds of the movie condensed onto a single frame. And you can see at the top of the slide in the yellow, the typically developing viewer goes back and forth between the top part of the face, looking at the eyes. The gentleman with autism looks at the mouth, and you can see the back and forth to the green region because Liz Taylor's head's moving a little bit. That's where it's moving towards the bottom, but it's a different focus. And this turned out to be very consistent. Next slide, please. So the situation is like this in autism. How many people do you think are hidden in this picture? How many Navy SEALs can you see? Take just a second to look. Next slide, please. So quite a few. And effectively, this is kind of the metaphor for folks with autism, being able to see the people for the trees, that it's a real problem for them to disentangle. It's a real burden for them. And one of the things I explained to teachers of primary school and high school is that it's as if the person with autism is getting some small fraction, maybe 10 or 15% of the social affective information the rest of us do in interaction. Next slide, please. So development of the field, one of the things that's happened in the 1970s, we became aware that autism was brain-based, it was highly genetic, and it responded better to structured teaching. As a result, there's been an explosion of research Since 1980, when autism was first recognized, with earlier diagnosis and treatment, more students are doing better and better, and they are seeking colleges. This is great, but it also presents many challenges for teachers and other learning supporters. Often academics or certain areas are much stronger areas for these children and youth, I should say, than their adaptive skills. Adaptive skills refers to street smarts. These are kids who may know a tremendous amount about a topic area, but they're having trouble meeting the demands of everyday life. This kind of self-monitoring and organization may be a real problem for them, and we're going to talk more about organizational strategies in just a second. There also may be issues of social interaction both within and outside the classroom. Within the classroom, these students may need help in understanding classroom etiquette. They have a very real risk for bullying, and that's something we should always be aware of. They are very frequently bullied. The data available suggests that between 40 and 70% of people with the autism spectrum disorders are bullied. Next slide. And now we're transitioning to my colleague, Kimberly Bean. It's been a real pleasure talking with you, and I hope you visit our website to find more information.
Hello, everyone. This is Barbara Cook with Kimberly Bean, and we're going to talk about how we can link these challenges that Fred has spoken about and strengths to effective teaching. So we're going to start first by talking about universal design for learning. Next slide. So what is universal design for learning? This is a theory and practice that was outlined by Ann Meyer, David Rose, and David Gordon in the 1990s. The purpose of universal design for learning was focused on how we could customize our instruction to meet individual needs. It is a strategy that focuses on understanding that as individuals, that we all have different areas of strength in our learning. So whether our strengths are auditory, visual, tactile, or kinesthetic in focus. When looking at universal design for learning, our key focus is on how are we engaging students in the learning process, what are the ways in which we represent the material that we present, and how can we actually provide situations for students to be engaged in action and express their knowledge and understanding of what it is we're trying to instruct. I do encourage everyone to go to the website cast.org for a variety of materials on how to implement universal design for learning. Today, Kim and I will give you some preliminary ideas. Next slide, please. So if you're going to be using a universal design for learning approach, it's helpful to have some key questions to consider. So questions that talk about how will learners engage with your lesson? How will the information be presented to the learners so that everyone in your classroom can access the material in an equitable way? And then how are learners expected to act strategically to express themselves? So as we move through the rest of the presentation, Kim will share with all of you the challenges and strengths that we typically see in college students with autism spectrum disorder. And then we'll use these questions to share some key strategies to help you. Kim?
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, in order to help support the needs of our students with autism in our classrooms, we need to be able to first identify their challenges and their strengths. Next slide, please. So what you might observe in your students in both on-ground and online classes, and this goes back to the concept that Fred had talked about earlier with being able to, difficulty seeing the bigger picture. And they may be, so when you think about when you're assigning assignments to your students, they may be better at seeing the small steps of the assignment, but miss the larger concept, or they may focus too long on one part of the assignment and then not move towards completion in order to complete the entire assignment. They may have difficulty starting a long-term assignment. And if the project is changed or expectations are changed within your semester, they may struggle making those changes, so adapting to the changes that are presented. What else you might see in terms of classrooms is just kind of if the student is entering the classroom and they might sit in the front row, very close to the instructor, not really recognizing the impact of the proximity, or they may sit in the back of the class away from everybody else within the classroom. In an online session, they may not really recognize that everyone can see them more clearly with their video on. So they might be eating a meal during a synchronous lesson and not really recognizing that others can have a very direct view of what that looks like. Next slide, please. So again, what you might be observing in the students is that they may rely on auditory reception, but they really benefit from the visually presented information. We'll get more into the visual strategies later on in the presentation. But you may notice that they may not bring tools to take notes. And so they might not be using any kind of notebooks or agendas to organize their work. And they may confuse messages from you as the professor, not really relying on your voice and the prosody in your voice. And so they're therefore missing that communication that you're giving. Next slide, please. And the interactions in class with either you as the professor or peers in groups can range on a continuum from little to no interaction or excessive interaction due to their challenges with perspective taking. So their point of view is really skewed to their singular perspective, their own perspective. They may share jokes or use sarcasm in awkward instances with peers or a professor, or they may not understand when jokes and sarcasm is used towards them, okay, or in context. They may share opinions about various topics of interest and maybe pass judgment on those that not really considering others' point of view. They may think that all questions are directed to them, and they might be interrupting a lot or raising their hand a lot to speak during sessions, or they may not think the questions are related to them at all because their name hasn't been called. They may also exhibit some ghosting of classes, so not coming to class either in a virtual or an online, virtual or in-person classes, and they may really not consider the impact of their learning, the impact on what their peers are thinking or their professor is thinking.
So let's look at some questions to consider. Next slide, please. So the first could be looking at how you are presenting material. So this is that universal design concept of your role as a course instructor and how materials presented to students, and how to present this material in a way that adjusts to this Gestalt learning style. As both Fred and Kim mentioned earlier, this population of individuals may struggle to see the forest through the trees, as they say. They may actually take away large chunks of information. So as part of this Gestalt learning style, so chunking content can be helpful. However, within that chunking of content, we want to highlight what is salient. Frequently, the salient information of the context is what is frequently missed by this population. So focusing on too many of the small details and not highlighting those details that matter the most, and then helping them connect back to the whole again. So how that salient information links back to the larger concept. Showing models of expected work is important. I know as a professor, frequently we may be concerned about showing models that then result in copying of information. However, our experiences reveal that frequently does not happen, and that seeing how the expected outcome of a project should appear can actually help individuals with autism back to this idea of understanding what is salient in that project that they should focus on. And then making explicit connections of the course content to other courses that a student might have to take, but more importantly, to their career. So how is this course in Philosophy 100 or Philosophy 101 actually going to have an impact on an individual who is a physics major? Very interesting connection indeed, but it can be made. Next slide, please. So then the next thing that we want to look at is how material is presented to adjust to their potentially weaker auditory versus stronger visual modality for learning. As Kim indicated before, we know that individuals with autism may want to rely on their auditory system to receive information. And that partly may be due to not being exposed to recognizing the ability for the visual modality to actually support some of their weaker auditory skills. So in this idea of we would want to present things visually as often as possible, we would want to have some video examples, maybe even provide graphic organizers of the content. If you could click the button for the little visual that will come in. So here is an example of a visual that is essentially trying to represent what can happen in a class dynamic with what people say and what people think. We want to give time to respond to taking notes. You can click the button, please. So really important that as you're presenting, that there are pauses, especially at those highlighted, emphasized times to give opportunity for note-taking, using precise language for explanation and directions, and to be brief and to be concise, as the example is going to show in a second. There we go. So write a 300-word limit summary, right? Being very brief and concise with the expectations of an assignment. Next. Okay, I think Kim is going to talk to you about some organizational challenges.
So along with the instruction strategy, the strategies that we use when we are instructing classes, we also have to think about as we are designing our classes and presenting our course syllabus and assignments and all of the requirements within the semester, that we do it in a way that that is clear for all learners. And one of the ways to do this is really coming back to your syllabus and being as detailed as possible in your syllabus. And that really is your visual support. And one tool that you can use within online settings or online courses or face-to-face formats is the use of Blackboard as a hub to have all of your information in your course really outlined for your students, so that all students can go to Blackboard to really get a clear understanding of the requirements for each week. And you can use your syllabus as a guide for that. So it's really important to be as clear as possible, highlight information within the syllabus, because we know that there is a lot of information required to put in a syllabus, but really being mindful of what is that most important information that they need, that your students need to take away from the syllabus expectations. And then within the course content outline, really being mindful about organizing week to week or session to session, what topic you're covering, and then what the students are responsible to do. So in the image to the right of the slide, you can see just an example of the date of the session, the topic that's being covered within the lecture, and then the readings or assignments that are due, so that each student is clear in terms of what they're responsible for before the session begins. So that's just one way to then make sure that things are very concrete and organized to help all of our students in our courses stick to that framework. When you're assigning assignments and you have descriptions of your assignment, you might think to kind of create a task list format rather than a paragraph description. So kind of doing it in a numbered format in terms of how you want, what are the requirements, and kind of having those clear expectations and a rubric for each of those different tasks within the assignments. As Dr. Cook had spoken about earlier, in terms of maybe using a sample assignment, that could be really helpful. Also, if you're not comfortable using an exemplar or a sample assignment, maybe using graphic organizers or a template to then again help each student organize their thoughts and make sure that all of the requirements of those assignments are met. Also, as you are planning out your assignments throughout a semester-long course, you want to make sure that we're having adequate time in between the assignments, and that and you can use Blackboard to set reminders and set up the calendar within to then keep everybody on track throughout the course. You could also set meeting dates with students and use your office hours to check in with students. So some students may be more comfortable talking one-on-one outside of class. And so you might want to set some check-ins with your students to make sure that everything is presented clearly and that there are no questions. And if you're doing online office hours, you could always just share your screen to guide through course materials and make sure, again, that everybody's clear on those expectations. Next slide, please. Okay, so sometimes even when we have all of these strategies, there may be still some breakdown. There may be some misinterpretation related to the communication or the instruction, and the student may be seeking some support in a variety of ways. Sometimes they may be asking for help during office hours, or sometimes they may be asking a lot of questions during the actual lecture itself. And so that can be that can be challenging for instructors in terms of how to make sure that we, as instructors, get through the content in a timely manner, but also make sure that our students are clear with all of the expectations and all of the material presented. So it's very important to, if there is a student that may be having some challenges understanding what's being presented, or they have a lot of different questions, again, saying and offering to meet with them after class. You say, write down your questions during class, and then we can meet after class to make sure that all of those points are really clear and that you're not taking up the time within your lecture time for the course. You want to make sure that you're still being able to meet all of the needs of all of the learners and no one is monopolizing too much time. But within your instruction, being able to make sure that you're giving clear examples and using clear language, exaggerating and emphasizing certain points like this is important, look here, maybe pairing with gestures and words and highlighting information within your lectures could be really important. Having like little quiz check-ins during your lectures, again, to kind of highlight on that very important information that you want all students to take away with, but maybe inputting some quizzes within your extended lectures could be really helpful. And I can't emphasize enough just the importance of providing that extra time if students need that extra support, to really kind of make sure that everybody's clear on the content and just making yourself available. I think especially in a virtual setting like we are in now, having that those sessions be, just being available to meet with students during your office hours to provide any more clarity is really important. Next slide.
So now we're going to shift to this idea of how do I support engagement in that lesson to assess learners to act strategically, but now during group work. So we want to think about the group membership, and it's really important. You can click, please. Thank you. It's important to consider that in a classroom setting now, even in our online environment, to pre-assign members, to consider the students in your space and which students might have a stronger skill set than others, so that there can kind of be a balance in the group to be more supportive of one another. It's also very helpful to define the roles for each member of the group. So for example, if you create a list of the different roles and responsibilities in a group, so a note taker, a timekeeper, the person who is going to kind of make sure that the conversation shifts, that everybody gets a turn, and sharing information with the activities is important. In addition to that group membership, you want to make sure that the task is clear for the group. So providing a detailed description of the task, potentially even using something referred to as task analysis. So what are the tasks that the group needs to accomplish within that time setting. So step 1, step 2, step 3, etc. Perhaps even providing the groups with a sense of time limits per task. It's not uncommon for groups to start on task 1 and the end of the 30-minute group session comes and they're still on task 1. So if you give them some guidelines about how much time they should spend, that can help them to move along to the next task. And expectations for out of class time work. So we know that we arrange group work during class time, and frequently we ask our students to engage outside of class. So what are those expectations? Which now leads to the third part of group work, which is communication for the group. It's really important for the group to develop group consensus for how they plan to communicate. Will they email? Will they use their phones and texting? Will they develop a platform called Group Meet, for example? Will they use Google? Will they use Southern's Microsoft Teams, etc.? And then included in that are, how is the group going to meet with the instructor? So it's really important, especially if you have individuals with autism spectrum disorders, or if you don't have or aren't fully aware that you have students with autism. It's always helpful to have at least one meeting with the group to check in, to make sure that all the members of the group feel supported by one another and that they're sharing in the work and understand the role of that group work. And if you can make a link to this collaboration in a group, to future work experience, to their career, and the importance of working with other people, that can even further enhance the use of group work.
Great. And the last piece of the presentation really focuses on how to engage all learners within your class, especially those with autism, to really take ownership of that engagement. And so there's a variety of strategies that you can use. We talked a lot about making sure that we highlight relevant information, but really being able to highlight the expectations for what students are expected to do each class. And that goes along with setting your expectations for participation, those expectations for group work. What does that look like in your classroom? And so really having that structured environment within your class and those clear expectations of participation. And then being able to kind of support the attention needs of all students, especially thinking about in virtual classes and having screen fatigue, thinking about offering a variety of different ways to respond to questions, so that you have encourage students that they can chat in, they can type in their answers, or they can use the raise the hand feature on through online settings, and but they don't always have to respond verbally. Okay, so even within live classes and face-to-face classes, you can still be using some polling and quizzing throughout your lessons to promote that engagement without having to feel that a student has to raise their hand all of the time to participate. So there's a variety of ways that you can do that within synchronous lessons, or within face-to-face lessons as well, through chats, through polling, through different forms of quizzes. So I think, again, just having a variety of tools available for all your students to help keeping them engaged throughout your courses and throughout your lectures will really help all learners within your classes. Next slide. And this is our last slide. So if there's any other information that you're seeking, or if you have questions about anything that we presented today, you can email us at the email listed here. You can visit our website as well, and you can follow us through social media. Thank you.
Thank you.